a man of God in a town called Redemption, a shepherd to a small, peaceful flock. His name was Pastor Elijah Kane, and his hands were for prayer, for comfort, for the turning of pages in a holy book. But the past has long, dark shadows, and a plague of soulless men came to his town, bringing a sermon of fire and death. The town of Redemption was a quiet prayer whispered against the vast, indifferent silence of the Arizona desert. It was an island of stubborn hope in a sea of sun-baked desolation, a collection of neat, whitewashed buildings that seemed to huddle together for comfort against the sheer, overwhelming scale of the landscape. Its people were a reflection of the town itself, quiet, hardworking, and deeply faithful. They were ranchers and farmers who had come to this isolated valley seeking not fortune, but peace, a place to raise their families far from the violent, chaotic heart of the territories. At the spiritual and physical center of this community stood the Redemption Community Church, a simple, elegant structure of local stone and timber, its steeple a proud, defiant finger pointed towards a sky that was often a hard and forgiving blue. And the man who stood in its pulpit, the man who was the very soul of the town's quiet faith, was Pastor Elijah Kane. To see him on a Sunday morning was to see a man in his perfect, ordained element. He was a tall, slender man in his late 40s, with a face that was more scholar than frontiersman, his features gentle, his eyes a warm, compassionate brown. His hands, when he raised them in benediction, were long and elegant, the hands of a man made for turning the thin, delicate pages of his well-worn Bible. His voice was a rich, soothing baritone, a voice that could calm a crying child, comfort a grieving widow, and, in his sermons, make the Word of God seem like a tangible, living presence in the small, sun-drenched chapel. He preached a gospel of forgiveness, of grace, of the quiet, unshakable strength that could be found in a faith that was as simple and as profound as the land itself. But there were things about the pastor that a careful observer might have found incongruous. For all his gentle compassion, there was a profound, and very deep, stillness in him, a kind of cold, watchful energy that never quite left, even when he smiled. He moved with a silent, fluid grace that was almost unnerving in a man of his size and profession. And his eyes, for all their warmth, missed nothing. They saw not just the souls of his flock, but the worn-out boots on the blacksmith's son, the new, worried lines on a rancher's wife, the subtle, almost invisible tremor in the hands of the town sheriff. It was a habit of observation that was far more acute than that of a simple country preacher. And then there was his left hand. It was a thing he kept, consciously or unconsciously, mostly hidden, tucked into the pocket of his black cassock, or resting, seemingly at ease, on the lectern. But on the rare occasions when it was visible, one could see the scars. A thin, silvery line that ran from his wrist to his knuckles. A small, puckered circle of old, healed tissue on the back of his hand. It was the hand of a man who had, at some point in his long-forgotten past, known a different kind of life, a life that was measured not in prayer, but in the brutal, bloody calculus of violence. The past, for Elijah Kane, was a locked, sealed, and very deep tomb. 20 years ago, he had not been a man of God. He had been a man who sent other men to their Maker. In the bloody, lawless border territories, he had been known by another name, a name that was a whisper of fear, a legend of death. He had been called Ghost Hand, a killer for hire, a man whose speed and accuracy with a specially modified Colt draw gun was a thing of supernatural, and very deadly, artistry. He had been a man who lived by a code of cold, professional detachment, his gun a tool of his trade, his soul a cold, empty place. The change, the road to his own, personal Damascus, had come in a single, terrible, and very bloody night. A job that had gone wrong. A final, chaotic gunfight that had resulted in the death of an innocent family, a family that had been caught in his crossfire. The sight of the child, a small, still figure in a blood-soaked dress, had been the thing that had finally, irrevocably, shattered the cold, empty shell of the man he had been. He had dropped his gun in the dust, had walked away from the money, from the life, from the very name of Ghost Hand, and had begun his long, arduous, and very solitary journey towards a redemption he was not sure he could ever truly find. The threat to his new, peaceful life, and to the town he had come to love, arrived in the form of a man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a new, and a very old, kind of evil. He was a man who had been a part of Elijah's old life, A rival, a man who had always been jealous of Ghost Hand's reputation, of his skill. And now Thorn, with his own newly formed army of killers, the Hollow Men, had come to the territory, not just for land, not just for money, but for a final, bloody reckoning with the ghost of his own bitter past. He had come for Elijah. The first sign of the coming storm was the discovery of the Miller family, ranchers from the far end of the valley, found murdered in their home, their bodies a testament to a cold and very professional kind of cruelty. The new, young, and very much out of his depth town sheriff had called it the work of a renegade Indian party. Elijah knew better. He had gone to the ranch, had looked at the scene, and his old, forgotten instincts had awakened with a cold, sickening jolt. He saw the signs, the precision of the kills, the small, almost invisible clues that the amateurs had missed. He had seen this kind of work before. He knew who had done it. He had tried to warn the sheriff, had tried to tell him that a great evil was coming to their valley. But the sheriff and the town council had looked at him as if he were mad. He was their gentle, compassionate pastor, not a tracker, not a lawman. What did he know of such things? And so, he had retreated to his chapel, and he had prayed. He had prayed for guidance. He had prayed for the strength to keep the ghost of his past buried. The final, irrevocable desecration came on a Sunday. Thorn and his Hollow Men, their confidence now absolute, their contempt for the small, peaceful town complete, chose the day of worship for their final, brutal message. They did not just ride into town. They stormed it. They came with fire and with guns. And their target was the heart and the soul of the town itself, the chapel. They rode their horses up the hill, their drunken, triumphant shouts a profane chorus against the quiet, peaceful morning. Elijah was in the middle of his sermon, his flock, his people, all gathered in the safety of God's house. He heard them coming. He stopped his sermon. He looked out at the faces of his people, at their fear, at their confusion, and he felt a profound, and a very terrible, sense of failure. He had brought this on them. His past, the ghost he had tried to bury, had followed him here, and it was about to consume them all. He walked to the front of the church and barred the heavy, oak doors. He turned to face his flock. "Do not be afraid," he said, his voice a calm, steady anchor in their rising sea of terror. "Have faith. The Lord is our shepherd. He will protect us." But as the first, heavy, splintering blow of the battering ram struck the door, as the first, terrified scream of a child echoed in the hallowed space, Elijah Kane knew, with a cold, sickening, and very final certainty, that faith and prayer would not be enough to save them. The time for the shepherd was over. The time for the ghost was at hand. The heavy oak doors of the Redemption Community Church shuddered, the wood groaning in protest as another thunderous blow from the battering ram struck home. Outside, the drunken, triumphant laughter of the Hollow Men mingled with the terrified, stifled sobs of the congregation huddled within. The air in the chapel, which moments before had been filled with the peaceful, hopeful words of a sermon, was now thick with the metallic taste of fear. Pastor Elijah Kane stood before the splintering doors, a solitary, black-clad figure, his back to his flock, his face a pale, grim mask. He was a shepherd, and the wolves were not just at his door, they were tearing it down. He had offered his people the shield of faith, but he knew, with a terrible, chilling certainty, that it was a shield of glass against a storm of iron. The door hinges, forged by the town's own blacksmith, groaned, and then gave way with a final, agonized screech. The doors burst inward, and the Hollow Men poured into the sanctuary, a flood of brutal, profane violence. They were led by a man whose face was a cruel, mocking parody of a human being, his eyes the dead, empty eyes of a snake. Marcus Thorn. "Well, well, Pastor," Thorn sneered, his voice a low, gravelly sound that was an offense in the sacred space. He took in the Senate terrified, huddled townspeople, the simple, beautiful altar, the tall and moving figure of the priest in a slow, ugly, and very satisfied smile spread across his face. "It seems your flock has gathered for a final prayer. How appropriate." Elijah did not speak. He just stood there, his body a silent and movable wall between the wolves and his sheep. He was absorbing their hatred, their violence, their sin, into himself. And in the deep, cold, and very locked place where the ghost of his past slept, a tremor was beginning. a shifting of old, heavy stones. I have been looking for you for a long, long time. Ghost hand, Thorn continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, a whisper that was meant only for Elijah, but which seemed to fill the entire, silent chapel. 20 years. I have dreamed of this day, the day I would finally stand over your grave. He then turned to his men. The town is ours, he boomed, his voice a triumphant roar. But first a lesson in the new theology of this valley, a lesson in the true nature of power. What followed was not just an act of destruction, it was a ritual of desecration. They moved through the chapel with a deliberate, and very creative, cruelty. They used the pages of the hymnals to light their cigars. They used the communion wine to wash the dust from their boots. They used the collection plates for a game of target practice, their pistol shots a deafening, sacrilegious thunder in the hallowed space. And then, they turned their attention to the people. They did not kill them. That was not Thorn's plan. His plan was a more subtle, and a far more cruel one. He was going to break them. He was going to shatter their faith, their hope, their very souls. They dragged the town's blacksmith, a good, decent man, from the crowd and forced him, at gunpoint, to use his own heavy hammer to smash the beautiful, hand-carved altar that he himself had helped to build. The man wept as he did at each blow a piece of his own, and the town's soul being shattered. They then took the blacksmith's son, a boy of no more than 15, and they dragged him outside. They took the large, wooden cross from the chapel's steeple, which they had already pulled down, and they crucified him, not with nails, but with ropes. They tied the boy to the cross and hoisted it up, in the center of the town square, a living, weeping, and very public mockery of the town's faith. It was this final, ultimate act of desecration, this perversion of the most sacred symbol of his own, hard-won redemption, that finally, irrevocably, broke the chains that had held the ghost of Elijah's past. He had stood, a passive, silent sponge, absorbing their evil. But as he looked out the shattered doorway of his church, at the boy on the cross, at the triumphant, laughing face of Marcus Thorn, something inside him, a thing that had been sleeping for 20 long, quiet years, awoke. The change was not a loud, explosive thing. It was a quiet, and a very terrible, transformation. The sorrow in his brown eyes was extinguished, burned away by a new, and a very old fire. A fire that was as cold, and as white-hot, as a star. The gentle, compassionate face of the priest hardened, the lines of it seeming to recarve themselves into a mask of absolute, and very final, judgment. The stooped, scholarly posture straightened, and he seemed to gain not just in height, but in a kind of dark, and very terrifying, density. The man who had been Pastor Elijah Kane was gone. In his place stood Ghost Hand. He turned, his movements now a thing of fluid, economic grace. He did not speak to his terrified flock. He did not offer them a final prayer. He walked, with a slow, deliberate, and utterly silent purpose, not to the front of the chapel, but to the pulpit. The pulpit was a massive, heavy, and very solid piece of oak, a symbol of the unshakable foundation of his faith. He placed his hands on it. The townspeople, who were watching him with a new, dawning, and very fearful awe, thought he was going to make a final, desperate appeal to his tormentors. He was not. He was opening his tomb. With a single powerful, and very practiced motion, he slid the heavy, Bible-stand top of the pulpit to one side, revealing a hidden, deep, and velvet-lined compartment. It was a space that no one in the town, no one in his new life, had ever known existed. Inside, nestled in the faded, dark red velvet, was the ghost of the man he had once been. A single, beautiful, and very deadly-looking weapon. A Colt Dragoon revolver. But it was a Dragoon like no other. Its long, heavy barrel had been perfectly balanced, its action honed to a hair-trigger smoothness, its grip a custom-carved piece of dark, polished ebony. It was the instrument of an artist. A deadly artist. And beside it lay a gun belt, its leather dark and supple, its single, custom-made holster hanging at a sharp, aggressive, and very fast, cross-draw angle. He strapped on the gun belt, its familiar, heavy weight a thing that seemed to settle not just on his hips, but in his very soul. He took the Dragoon, its weight a perfect, familiar, and very deadly fit in his scarred left hand. He turned to face the open doorway of his church, the gun held loosely, ready, at his side. He was no longer a shepherd. He was no longer a man of peace. He was a killer, a legend, a ghost who had just been resurrected. And he was about to deliver a new, and a very different, and a very final sermon. A sermon that would be written not in words, but in the fire, and the blood, and the final, damned souls of the men who had been foolish enough to awaken him. There in the ruined chapel was a thick and holy mixture of fear, whiskey, and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh spilled blood from the men Elijah had already dealt with. Marcus Thorne, who had been enjoying the spectacle of the boy on the cross from the chapel doorway, turned at the sound of the sudden, profound silence from within. He saw a sight that was so impossible, so utterly contradictory to the world as he knew it, that for a long, stunned moment, his mind refused to process it. He saw the priest. But it was not the priest. It was a ghost, a legend, a figure from the bloody, half-forgotten history of the border wars. The black cassock was gone, replaced by the simple, dark, and very practical clothes of a gunfighter. And on his hip, and a cross-draw holster that was a signature, a trademark, as famous and as feared as the man himself, was the long, heavy, and very deadly barrel of a Colt drawgun. Ghost hand, Thorne whispered the name, a dry, rustling sound of a dawning, and very absolute, horror. The remaining hollow men, a half-dozen of them who were still inside the chapel, also saw the transformation. They had been terrorizing a priest. They were now facing a legend. And their drunken, arrogant confidence evaporated in a hot, white flash of pure, animal fear. Elijah Kane did not speak. He did not issue a challenge. He was not a lawman. He was not a hero. He was a professional. And he was at work. His left hand, the hand that had given him his name, the hand that had been a blur of motion, a thing of myth and legend, moved. It was not a fast draw, not in the flashy, peacocking way of a saloon gunfighter. It was a movement of pure economic and utterly final efficiency. The dragoon was in his hand, cocked and aimed, in a single, fluid motion that was a part of his very breathing. The first shot was not a wild, chaotic thing. It was a lesson, a statement of intent. He did not aim for Thorne. He did not aim for any of the men. He aimed for the heavy, iron bell that had been torn from the steeple and was now lying on its side in the aisle. The roar of the massive, .44 caliber dragoon in the enclosed space of the chapel was a deafening, concussive thunderclap, a sound of judgment, a sound of doom. The heavy, lead slug struck the iron bell with a force that sent a deep, resonant, and very mournful bong echoing through the ruined sanctuary. A sound that was the funeral toll for every man in that room. The lesson was over. The sermon of blood was about to begin. He was not just a gunfighter. He was a master of the terrain. He had built this chapel. He knew its every secret, its every angle. He kicked over a heavy, oak lectern, creating a piece of instant, solid cover. And from behind it, he went to work. His second shot took the man who was closest to the door, a man who was trying to make a run for it. The heavy slug took him in the center of the chest, lifting him from his feet and throwing him back, out of the very door he had so arrogantly kicked in. His third shot took the man who was foolish enough to try and raise his own rifle. A clean, precise, and very final shot to the head. The remaining hollow men were no longer an army. They were a panicked, disorganized mob of terrified individuals, trapped in a killing box with a ghost who was systematically, and very calmly, killing them all. They began to fire wildly, their bullets chewing at the oak lectern, sending showers of splinters into the air. But they were firing at a target that was no longer there. Elijah was moving. He was a shadow, a whisper, a force of nature in his own, sacred, and now very deadly, home. He used the overturned pews, the pillars, the deep, religious shadows of the chapel, as his allies. He was a master of the ricochet, a skill that had been one of his most famous and most terrifying trademarks. He fired not at the man who was hiding behind a thick, stone pillar, but at the curved, stone wall of the apse behind the altar. The heavy, lead slug struck the stone, flattened, and screamed off at an impossible, but very much calculated, angle, taking the man in the back. Marcus Thorne, who had been frozen in a state of shocked, uncomprehending terror, finally broke. He was not a fighter. He was a leader, a man who directed the violence of others. He was a wolf who was only brave when he was surrounded by his pack. Now, His pack was being slaughtered around him. He turned and ran, a desperate, scrambling, and very cowardly flight out of the chapel and into the chaos of the town square. Elijah did not follow him. Not yet. He had work to do. He had a promise to keep. A promise to himself, and to the people of this town. One by one, the remaining hollow men who were trapped in the chapel were dispatched, with a cold, professional, and almost surgical precision. The ghost hand was not a creature of rage. He was a creature of absolute, and very final, efficiency. When he was done, he stood in the center of his ruined, and now very silent chapel. He was surrounded by the bodies of the men who had desecrated it. He was a priest, standing in a sanctuary that he had just, in his own terrible and very bloody way, reconsecrated. He calmly reloaded the spent chambers of his dragoon. He then walked out of the chapel, out into the harsh, bright sunlight of the town square. He was a solitary, black-clad figure, a ghost who had just been resurrected. And he was now coming for the man who had been foolish enough to dig him up. The town square of Redemption was a stage set for a very public execution. At one end stood the gallows, a stark, wooden skeleton against the hard, blue sky. At the other stood the ruined, smoldering shell of the Redemption Community Church. And in the middle, a drama of raw, primal fear was unfolding. Marcus Thorne was a man who had lost control. He was no longer the confident, sneering leader of the hollow men. He was a cornered, rabid animal. He had the boy, the blacksmith's son, still tied to the cross, and he had a half-dozen of his remaining, terrified men, who had been outside the chapel when the slaughter had occurred. And he had the townspeople, who had been a huddled, terrified mass, were now his prisoners, his hostages, his human shield. He had his men round them up, herding them into the center of the square, a frightened, weeping flock of sheep. He stood before them, his face a mask of insane, desperate rage, a pistol in his hand. "He is a demon," Thorne screamed, his voice a high, thin sound of a man on the edge of a complete mental breakdown. "A ghost. He will not have this town. If I cannot have it, then no one will. I will burn it to the ground, and I will start with all of you." He was a man who had lost the game, and was now determined to kick over the board. It was into this tense, volatile, and very deadly to blow that Elijah Kane walked. He emerged from the dark, silent doorway of his church, a solitary, black-clad figure, his long-barreled dragoon held loosely, ready, in his scarred left hand. He did not walk with a gunfighter's swagger. He walked with the slow, deliberate, and utterly fearless pace of a man who was on his way to his own, personal, and very final, judgment day. He stopped at the edge of the town square, 100 yards from Thorne and his hostages. He was one man, against a half-dozen, with the lives of his entire flock hanging in the balance. The town held its breath. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft, mournful sigh of the desert wind and the low, terrified sobs of a child in the crowd. "Thorne," Elijah said, and his voice was not a shout. It was a low, calm, and very clear sound that seemed to cut through the tension like a knife. "This is between you and me. Let the people go. Let the boy go. This is a sin of my own making. Let me be the one to pay the price." He was offering a trade, his life for theirs. Thorne stared at him, his eyes the wide and blinking eyes of a madman. He had been hunting a ghost, a legend. And now, the legend was offering himself up. It was a victory beyond his wildest, most blood-soaked dreams. He laughed, a harsh, broken, and very ugly sound. "The great ghost hand," he sneered. "The man who cannot be killed. You think you can make a deal with me? There are no deals. There is only this." He raised his pistol, not at Elijah, but at the boy on the cross. "You will watch, priest," he hissed. "You will watch as I take everything you love. You will watch as I dismantle your new, pathetic little life. And then, when you have nothing left but your own miserable soul, then I will send you to hell." He was not just going to kill him. He was going to torture him. He was going to make him watch his world burn all over again. But as he was about to pull the trigger, a new and very unexpected voice was heard. It was not a voice of fear. It was a voice of pure, unadulterated, and very righteous rage. "Get your filthy hands off my son." It was the blacksmith, the boy's father. He was not a part of the huddled, terrified crowd. He had been in his forge, and he had just emerged, his face a mask of terrible, paternal fury, his massive, powerful hands holding not a rifle, but the heavy, long-handled sledgehammer that was the tool of his trade. He was not alone. Behind him stood the other men of the town, the ranchers, the farmers, the storekeeper. They were no longer a flock of sheep. They were a pack of angry, cornered wolves. They had been pushed too far. Their fear had been burned away, replaced by a cold, hard, and very unified rage. They were armed with hunting rifles, with shotguns, with pistols, with anything they could find. They were a posse, an army, the army of a town that had finally, and irrevocably, found its soul. The town of redemption was no longer holding its breath. It was about to let out a roar of defiance, of courage, and of a long, and a very bloody, overdue justice. The appearance of the blacksmith and the armed men of the town was the spark that ignited the powder keg. The tense, fragile stalemate of the town square was shattered, and the world dissolved into a maelstrom of chaotic, desperate, and very personal violence. Marcus Thorne, his mind now completely unhinged, his plan to execute the boy thwarted, spun towards this new, unexpected threat, his pistol roaring. He was a cornered animal, lashing out at the new pack of wolves that had just entered his killing ground. But the men of redemption were not a disorganized, panicked mob. They had a leader, a legend. Elijah Kane did not need to give a command. He simply acted. And the town, which had for so long looked to him for spiritual guidance, now looked to him for a different, and a far more primal, kind of leadership. They followed his lead. As Thorne's attention was focused on the blacksmith, Elijah moved. He was a ghost again, a blur of motion, a striking snake in the dust. He was not a man fighting a duel. He was a general, directing a battle. His first shot was not at Thorne. It was at the rope that held the cross upright. The heavy, lead slug from his dragoon, fired with a surgeon's impossible precision, severed the thick, hempen rope. The cross, with the boy still tied to it, tilted and then crashed to the ground, a cloud of dust and a collective gasp from the crowd marking its fall. The boy was down, out of the immediate line of fire, a living symbol of their defiance now, miraculously, saved. The act was a catalyst. The townspeople, seeing their priest's impossible, miraculous shot, let out a roar, a single, unified sound of pure, righteous fury, and they opened fire. The town square became a killing box. The hollow men, who had been the confident, arrogant masters of the situation, were now caught in a devastating, multi-front crossfire. They were no longer an army. They were a handful of terrified, outnumbered men, fighting for their lives against a whole town that had decided, as one, that it would rather die on its feet than live on its knees. Elijah was a storm in the heart of this chaos. He moved with a cold, detached, and utterly lethal purpose. He was not a man of God, dispensing mercy. He was an instrument of a harder, and a more final, kind of judgment. His dragoon roared, its heavy point for 4-caliber slugs a thing of brutal, stopping power. One of the hollow men, who was trying to use a horse trough as cover, was lifted from his feet, the big gun's impact a thing of pure, physical force. Another, who was trying to reload, was taken down with a clean, precise shot that was a testament to the fact that the ghost hand had not lost its touch. The blacksmith was a force of nature, a primal, paternal rage given a human, and a very large, form. He was not a gunfighter. He was a brawler. He waded into the fight, his heavy sledgehammer a terrifying, unstoppable weapon. He broke a man's rifle with a single, powerful blow. He shattered a man's arm with another. He was a giant, an anvil of a man, and he was bringing a very personal, and a very heavy, kind of justice to the men who had dared to harm his son. The battle for redemption was short, brutal, and utterly decisive. The hollow men, their leader now a raving, isolated madman, their numbers dwindling, their courage shattered, broke. They were not an army. They were a gang of hired thugs, and their loyalty was a thing of money, not of principle. They threw down their guns. They surrendered. Now, only one was left. Marcus Thorne. He stood alone in the center of the square, a solitary, defiant figure of evil, his pistol empty, his army gone, his empire in ruins. Elijah Kane walked towards him, his own gun now smoking, its work done. He walked through the carnage, through the bodies of the dead and the groans of the wounded, a grim, black-clad figure of retribution. He stopped, 10 feet from the man who had been his rival, his tormentor, his own personal demon. Thorn looked at him, his eyes the wide and blinking eyes of a man who has looked into the abyss and has seen his own damnation. He had lost. He knew it. But he was not a man to die on his knees. With a final, desperate, and very pathetic snarl, he drew a long, wicked-looking bowie knife from his belt and lunged. Elijah did not shoot him. He did not move. He just stood there, a calm, still center in a world of violence. And as Thorn lunged, the blacksmith, who had been standing, a silent, grim-faced guardian, just behind his priest, stepped forward. The sledgehammer, which had been an instrument of creation, now became an instrument of a final, and a very just, and a very brutal end. It swung once, a short, powerful, and utterly final arc. And the man who had brought so much death, and so much pain, to the town of redemption was now just a final, bloody punctuation mark in the town's own, very hard-won story of its own, very real. Redemption. The silence that fell over the town square in the wake of Marcus Thorn's brutal, final demise was a profound and a very heavy one. The echoes of the gunshots faded, leaving only the sound of the wind, the low groans of the wounded, and the collective, ragged breathing of a town that had just been to hell and back. The townspeople stood, their guns smoking, their faces a mixture of a grim, triumphant satisfaction and a deep, soul-crushing exhaustion. They looked at the bodies of the outlaws, then at the broken, but very much alive, form of the blacksmith's son, who was now being untied from the cross by his weeping, relieved mother. And they looked at their priest. Elijah Kane stood in the center of it all, a solitary, black-clad figure, his long-barreled drawgun still held in his scarred left hand. The ghost, the killer, the legend, was now fully, and very publicly, resurrected. He was their savior, their avenging angel. But he was also a stranger, a man of a terrible, violent power that they had never known, and could never truly understand. He was not looking at the townspeople. He was looking at the cross, the symbol of his own shattered faith, the instrument of a terrible, and a very personal, desecration. He walked to it, and he knelt in the dust before it. He was not praying. He was a man who was facing the wreckage of his own, very carefully constructed, life. He had come to this town to bury a ghost. And now, that ghost was the only thing that had saved them. He had come to this town to find a quiet, simple peace. And now, he was a man who was covered in the blood and the sin of a very necessary and a very holy war. The blacksmith came to stand beside him. He did not speak. He just placed a large, heavy, and very gentle hand on his priest's shoulder. It was a gesture of a profound, and a very simple, and a very human gratitude. A gesture that said, "We are with you. You are one of us." In the days and weeks that followed, the town of redemption was reborn. It was not a quiet, gentle rebirth. It was a noisy, chaotic, and very determined one. They buried their dead. They tended to their wounded. And they began to rebuild, not just their homes, but their very souls. They were no longer a town of quiet, peaceful, and very vulnerable sheep. They were a community of survivors, a town that had found its own hard and very unbending spine. And what of their priest? Elijah Kane did not leave. He could not. He was inextricably and irrevocably a part of this town now, a part of its new, and its very bloody, and its very proud history. He put away the gun. He did not bury it this time. He cleaned it with a slow, reverent care, and he placed it not in a hidden, secret tomb, but in a simple, wooden box, which he kept in his own private quarters. It was not a thing to be forgotten. It was a thing to be remembered, a tool, a burden, a part of who he was. He put on the black cassock of his old life. He was a priest again, but he was a different kind of priest. His sermons were different now. He still spoke of faith, of hope, of grace, but he also spoke of courage. He spoke of the necessity of good men to stand against the darkness. He spoke of the hard, and the sometimes very bloody, price of peace. He was a man who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and he had not just survived. He had conquered it. He was a man who had carried the weight of a terrible, violent past. And now, he had a new weight to carry. The weight of the cross, not as a symbol of his own personal penance, but as a symbol of the town he had, in the end, been willing to die for. He was Pastor Elijah Kane, the shepherd of redemption, a man of God, and a man of the gun. And he had, at long last, found a way to make his own, very personal, and a very hard one, peace between the two. The seasons turned, and the raw, open wound of the hollow men's raid on redemption began to slowly, and very painfully, heal. The physical scars on the town were the first to fade. The burned-out shell of the general store was torn down, and a new, larger, and more defiant one was built in its place, the work of a dozen families who now worked with a new, and a very powerful, sense of a shared, communal purpose. The bullet holes in the storefronts were patched, the shattered windows were replaced, and the gallows, the symbol of so much of the final, bloody confrontation, was quietly, and very deliberately, dismantled. It would use to build a new, strong fence around the schoolhouse. The town was not just rebuilding what it had lost, it was building something new, something stronger. The old passive, and slightly fearful peace was gone, replaced by a new, more vigilant, and a more self-reliant spirit. The men of the town, who had been a disorganized, frightened mob, were now a well-trained, and a very well-armed town militia, their regular drills, led by the blacksmith, Ben, and New, and a very reassuring, Sunday afternoon ritual. The deeper, emotional scars, however, were a different matter. They were a part of the town's soul now, a shared, traumatic memory that had bound the community together in a way that 20 years of peaceful prosperity never could have. They were a quieter, more resilient, and a more watchful people now. They had learned a hard, and a very bloody, lesson about the true nature of the world that lay just beyond the borders of their peaceful valley. And at the heart of this new, transformed town was their priest, Father Elijah Kane. He was a man who was living in the quiet, and the very difficult, space between two legends. To the outside world, the story of the massacre at Redemption was a confused, and a very sensational one. It was the story of a town that had, miraculously, and very bloodily, saved itself. And at the heart of that story was the whisper of a ghost, a mysterious, black-clad preacher who had fought with the fury of a demon, a man some were beginning to call the angel of the apocalypse. But to the people of Trinity Creek, he was simply their pastor, their shepherd, their friend. They had seen the ghost, the killer, the legend, and they had not turned away from him. They had embraced him. They knew his secret, his sin, his burden, and in their quiet and spoken acceptance, they had given him the one thing he had never been able to find for himself, absolution. He was a different man. The haunted, sorrowful look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a new quiet and very deep peace. He was a man who had finally, and irrevocably, made peace with the two warring halves of his own soul. He was a man of God who knew the ways of the gun. He was a man of peace who had been forced to make a terrible, and a very necessary, war. He still preached his sermons on Sunday, his voice the same, rich, soothing baritone. But his words had a new weight, a new depth. He spoke of the parable of the wolf and the sheep, but he spoke of it with the hard-won wisdom of a man who knew that sometimes the shepherd must also have the heart of a wolf to protect his flock. The first, tangible sign of the new harvest, of the new life that was growing from the ashes of the old, came in the spring. A new family, a young couple with two small children, their wagon laden with all their worldly possessions and their faces filled with a tired, but a very hopeful, light, arrived in the valley. They were looking for a place to start a new life. In the old days, they would have been met with a cautious, and a slightly fearful, suspicion. But now, they were met with open arms. The town, which had for so long been a closed, and a slightly fearful, community, had learned the value of strength in numbers, of the power of a shared, and a very open, welcome. Elijah stood on the steps of his rebuilt chapel and watched as the townspeople gathered to greet the newcomers, as the blacksmith offered to shoe their horses for free, as the storekeeper offered them a line of credit, as the women of the town brought them fresh-baked bread and a warm, genuine welcome. He saw the blacksmith's son, who was no longer a boy, but a young man who had seen the face of death and had not flinched, take the hand of the newcomer's young daughter, Ashai. hopeful smile on his face. He saw the beginning of a new story, a new generation, a new, and a very hopeful future for this town. He was not just a priest anymore. He was a founder. He was a patriarch. He was the quiet, steady, and very much beloved heart of a town that had, in the end, lived up to its name. It had found its own, very real, and a very hard one, redemption. And in doing so, it had given the same, miraculous, and very precious gift to the man who had been its shepherd, its warrior, and its own, very human, soul. For 2 years, the town of Redemption enjoyed a period of quiet, industrious, and very vigilant peace. The new, hard-won unity of the community was a powerful, and a very real thing. The town grew, the new families attracted by the stories of a place that was safe, a place that was protected not just by a sheriff, but by a community that had learned how to protect itself. The valley prospered, its fields green, its cattle fat, its future bright, and a very hopeful thing. Father Elijah Kane was at the heart of it all. He was the town's moral compass, its spiritual guide, its quiet, steady, and very much respected leader. The ghost of Ghost Hand was a quiet, sleeping thing, a legend that was a part of the town's history, a story to be told in hushed, proud tones by the old-timers. But the West was a place of long, and of very dark, shadows. And the past, for a man like Elijah, was never truly buried. It was just waiting. The shadow on the horizon, the first, new sign of a trouble that was far older, and far more dangerous, than the brutish, simple evil of Marcus Thorne, arrived in the form of a letter. It came on the noon stage, a fine, elegant envelope of a kind that was rarely seen in a town like Redemption, its wax seal complex, and a very familiar sigil. The sigil of the New Orleans Syndicate. Elijah opened it with his old steady, and now slightly trembling, hands. The letter was not a threat. It was a plea. It was from an old man, one of the last of the syndicate's original founders, a man who had been a kind of dark, and very twisted, mentor to the young, orphan boy who had become the surgeon. He was a man who had, in his own, very brutal way, lived by a code. And he was a man who was now losing a very bloody, and a very final, civil war. The syndicate, in the wake of the disastrous, and very public, failure of its western expansion plans, a failure that had been laid squarely at the feet of the now dead Marcus Thorne, had collapsed in on itself. The old, brutal peace that had held the city's underworld in a state of a very profitable, and a very stable, equilibrium, was shattered. The city was a cauldron of violence, the different factions tearing each other apart, the streets running with the blood of the innocent as much as the guilty. And in the middle of it all was the old man's granddaughter. A young, innocent, and very beautiful girl, who had been taken as a pawn, a hostage, a prize to be claimed by the victor of this new, brutal war. "You are the only man I have ever known," the old man's letter concluded, its elegant script a shaky, desperate scrawl, "who possessed both the skills of a devil and the heart of a man. I am not asking for the devil to return. I am praying that the man still lives. I am not asking you to fight for me, or for the syndicate. I am begging you, as a father, and as a friend, to save my child." Elijah sat in the quiet, peaceful sanctuary of his rebuilt chapel, the letter in his hand, a ghost from a world he had thought he had left forever. He looked out the window, at the town he loved, at the children who were playing in the square, at the simple, beautiful, and very hard-won peace he had helped to build. He had found his redemption. He had earned his peace. He was a man of God, a man of peace. But the echo of the gun was a powerful one, and the cry of an innocent, a ghost of the one, innocent life he had failed to save so long ago, a sin he had spent 20 years atoning for, was a cry he did not know if he could ignore. The war for his own soul, which he had thought was over, had just, in a new, and a very unexpected, and a very distant way, begun again. He was a man who was once again caught between his faith and his past, between the shepherd and the ghost, and he had to make a choice, a final, and a very terrible, and a very human choice. The letter from New Orleans was a stone dropped into the quiet, peaceful pond of Father Elijah Kane's new life. Its ripples spread, disturbing the calm, reflecting a past he had fought so hard, and so bloodily, to escape. For a week, he was a man at war with himself, a silent, solitary struggle that was fought in the dead of night, in the quiet, empty confines of his chapel. He was a creature of two worlds, the quiet, sunlit world of redemption, and the dark, gaslight, and very bloody world of his youth. He did not speak of the letter to anyone. This was a burden that was his alone to bear, a final, personal trial of his own, very tested faith. But the people of his flock, who now knew him so well, saw the change in him. They saw the return of the old, haunted look in his eyes, the quiet, profound stillness that was not peace, but a deep, and very troubled, contemplation. The blacksmith, Ben, a man whose friendship with his priest was now a thing of a deep, and a very quiet, and a very solid, understanding, came to him one evening. He found Elijah not in the chapel, but in the town's small, quiet cemetery, standing before a single and marked grave, the grave where they had buried the first innocent victims of Marcus Thorne's raid. "The ghosts are walking again, Father," Ben asked, his voice a low, gentle rumble. Elijah did not turn. He just stared at the simple, wooden cross. "They are never truly gone, my friend," he said, his voice a weary and a very human whisper. "They are just sleeping." He finally turned to his friend, and in his eyes, Ben saw not a priest, not a legend, but a man, a good man, who was wrestling with a terrible and a very heavy choice. "There is a girl," Elijah said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "An innocent. She is caught in a war that is not of her own making. A war that I helped to create a long, long time ago. And you believe you are the only one who can save her," Ben finished, his own, simple, and very profound, wisdom cutting to the heart of the matter. "I am the only one who knows the terrain," Elijah replied. "The only one who knows the players. The only one who can walk into that world and, perhaps, walk out again." "And what of this world?" Ben asked, his gaze sweeping over the quiet, peaceful valley. "What of your flock? What of us?" "You are the reason I must go," Elijah said, his voice gaining a new, hard strength. "I have taught this town to be strong, to be vigilant, to stand for itself. And I have taught them that the highest law is the protection of the innocent. If I turn my back on this girl now, then everything I have preached, everything I have fought for, is a lie." He was a man who was trapped, not by his past, but by his own hard-won and very unbending moral code. He made his decision in the quiet, pre-dawn hours, in the silence of his own, very tested, heart. He would go. He would answer the call. He came to the blacksmith's forge as the sun was rising. He was not dressed as a priest. He was dressed as a simple traveler, in a plain, buckskin coat and sturdy, trail-worn boots. He had a single, small saddlebag in his hand. Ben was there, waiting for him. He had known what the decision would be. He had a horse, saddled and ready, the best and the fastest in the valley. And he had something else. He handed Elijah a long, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. Elijah took it, its weight a familiar, and a very heavy thing. He unwrapped it. It was his gun, his Colt draw gun. "The ghost hand." A shepherd, Ben said, his voice a low, steady rumble, must have his staff, to guide his flock, and to fight off the wolves. Elijah looked at the gun, the symbol of the life he had tried so hard to escape, the tool of the ghost he had tried so hard to bury. He knew that to take it would be to embrace the very darkness he had fought so hard to overcome. But he also knew that to go into the world he was going into without it would be suicide. He strapped on the gun belt. Its weight was a heavy, and a very real, and a very final burden. He was not going as the surgeon. He was not going as a killer. He was going as a man of God, who was, in a final, and a very desperate act of faith, taking up the tools of the devil to do an angel's work. He rode out of redemption that morning, a solitary figure on the vast, empty plains. He did not look back. He was a man riding towards a dangerous, and a very uncertain, future. But he was also a man who was, for the first time truly, and completely, at peace with the two, warring halves of his own soul. The war for the soul of the town was over. The war for the soul of the world, a war that is fought one small, desperate, and very human act of courage at a time, had just, for the quiet, and the very remarkable, priest of redemption, begun again. The journey to New Orleans was a long, and a very solitary one. For 3 weeks, Elijah Kane rode east, a man moving against the tide of history, leaving the raw, open, and honest world of the frontier and riding back into the complex, decadent, and very corrupt part of the civilized world. He was a ghost, returning to his own personal graveyard. He was a man transformed. He was not the priest of redemption. He was not the killer of the border wars. He was a new, and a very quiet, and a very focused synthesis of the two. He was a warrior priest, a man whose faith was now a thing of hard, unbending steel, and whose gun was now an instrument of a very personal, and a very holy, kind of justice. He arrived in the city of New Orleans not as a specter of the past, but as a quiet, unassuming traveler. The city was a place of ghosts, a place of memories, but he did not allow them to touch him. He was a man on a mission, a sacred mission. He found the city in the grip of the bloody, chaotic civil war that the old man's letter had described. The syndicate was tearing itself apart, and the streets of the French Quarter were a nightly stage for a very public, and a very bloody, kind of theater. He did not go to his old haunts. He did not seek out the remnants of his old life. He became a whisper, a shadow, a man who moved through the back alleys, who listened in the quiet, dark corners of the city's taverns. He was a hunter again, and he was gathering his intelligence. He learned that the old man, his mentor, was dead, a victim of the very war he had tried to stop. And he learned that the old man's granddaughter, a girl named Isabella, was now the prisoner, and the prize of the new, and the very ruthless, leader of the syndicate, a man named Julian Thorne's younger, and even more ambitious, brother. The final, bloody irony of his life was now complete. He had come here to save an innocent, and he had found himself facing the ghost of his own, most terrible sin. The final confrontation took place not in a dusty, sun-baked street, but in the opulent, gaslight confines of a decadent, New Orleans mansion. Elijah did not go in with his guns blazing. That was not his way. He went in as a priest, a man of God who had come to offer the last rites to a dying man. He found the girl. He found the new Thorne. And he found his own final, and very personal, redemption. The fight was not a long one. It was a quiet, surgical, and very final affair. The surgeon, the ghost hand, had returned for one last, and very necessary, operation. He did not stay in New Orleans. The city, with its ghosts, was not his home anymore. He took the girl, Isabella, a young, frightened, but very resilient survivor, and he took her with him. He rode back west, back to the clean, honest, and very real world of the frontier. He did not know what the future held. He was a priest with a gun, a man of God with a very bloody past, and now a guardian to a young, orphan girl. He was a man who had been a shepherd. He had been a killer. He had been a priest. And now he was something new. He was a father. As he rode, with the girl by his side, towards the distant, hazy, and very hopeful horizon of the town of redemption, he knew that his life's journey was not over. It was just, in a new, and a very different, and a very blessed way, beginning. The shepherd's crook had become a warrior's blade, and now it was, at long last, a father's guiding hand.